Open Debates, SKN Global Roundup. April 2nd, 2026. The world did not step back from danger. It spread the consequences across every region. April 2nd was the kind of day that exposes how fragile the global order has become. The Iran war kept radiating far beyond the battlefield, driving up oil, straining NATO, unsettling markets, and forcing governments far from the Gulf to adjust their posture. At the same time, the day's wider pattern was unmistakable. One crisis was now feeding many others. Europe was arguing openly with Washington. Africa was being warned of economic blowback. Haiti remained trapped in an internationalized security collapse. And even the Pacific was showing signs of strategic tension under the shadow of China. French President Emmanuel Macron gave public expression to what much of Europe now appears to be thinking. Speaking during a state visit to South Korea, he criticized Donald Trump's mixed messages on NATO and Iran, arguing that seriousness, consistency, and stability matter in global affairs. His intervention was not just a personal rebuke. It was a warning that alliance trust is being weakened from the top. When a leading European head of state has to remind Washington that international security cannot be run on improvisation, the issue is no longer style. It is credibility. The economic shock widened at the same pace as the diplomatic one. Oil surged, with US crude briefly hitting $110 a barrel, while market anxiety deepened over inflation, transport costs, and slower growth. This was not an abstract financial story. Energy shocks do not stay on trading screens. They move quickly into food, mortgages, shipping, and public anger. By April 2nd, the cost of war was already becoming a cost of living story for households that had nothing to do with starting it. The Strait of Hormuz crisis made the alliance problem even more visible. Britain convened talks involving around 40 countries on how to pressure Iran to reopen the waterway, which carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil, yet the United States did not join that initiative. The meeting focused on diplomatic and economic pressure first, with military planning deferred to follow-up talks. That matters because it showed a coalition trying to coordinate around a global choke point without the country that usually insists on leading these moments. The symbolism was hard to miss. When the crisis is global but Washington stands apart from the coordination effort, the question becomes whether the West still knows how to act together. Russia, meanwhile, positioned itself exactly where disorder often benefits it most. Moscow said it was ready to help resolve the Iran conflict, even as the Kremlin also emphasized its energy coordination with Saudi Arabia through OPEC+, and made clear it was protecting its own personnel connected to Iran's Bushehr nuclear plant. Russia did not need to control the crisis to gain from it. Higher prices, divided Western attention, and louder NATO arguments all create strategic breathing room for the Kremlin. That is often how modern advantage works, not through order, but through someone else's confusion. Ukraine kept fighting while the world looked elsewhere. Even as the Middle East dominated the headlines, Europe's wider security anxieties remained tied to Russia, sanctions, and the risk of strategic distraction. The Iran conflict was not replacing the Ukraine war. It was competing with it for attention, resources, and urgency. That is dangerous for Kyiv, because wars do not become less destructive simply because another one becomes more fashionable in the media cycle. South Asia produced one of the day's most interesting shifts. Pakistan, long treated internationally as a security problem, was increasingly being framed as a potential diplomatic broker. Reuters described its effort to reposition itself as a mediator in the Iran war, while also engaging in Afghanistan-related talks in China. That change matters because it shows how quickly a country's global role can change when larger powers need channels, intermediaries, and regional leverage. Pakistan is trying to turn instability into relevance, and on April 2nd that strategy was gaining traction. Africa's warning was blunt. A joint report involving UN agencies, the African Union, and the African Development Bank said a prolonged Middle East conflict could further slow Africa's growth in 2026 by disrupting trade, energy, and fertilizer supplies and worsening living costs. This was one of the day's most important moral stories because it highlighted a familiar injustice. Africa is repeatedly forced to absorb the consequences of conflicts it did not create. Some exporters may benefit from higher prices, but most countries face more pain, more inflation, and more pressure on already fragile economies. The Caribbean remained under the shadow of insecurity through Haiti's collapse. The arrival of foreign troops for a restructured gang suppression force underscored that Haiti is no longer simply a domestic crisis of governance. It is an international emergency shaped by gangs, displaced civilians, outside security actors, and regional instability. Every new external intervention carries the same question. Is the world helping Haiti recover, or merely trying to contain the fallout from its breakdown? Even the Pacific reflected the day's broader theme. A defense and security pact between New Zealand and the Cook Islands, reached after tension over the Cook Islands' separate strategic partnership with China, showed how even small island diplomacy now sits inside much larger contests for trust and influence. What looked on paper like a local repair of relations was in fact another signal that China's reach is reshaping political geometry, even in places once treated as peripheral. In the modern world, there are fewer peripheral places than powerful states like to imagine. What today really means, April 2nd, showed how one conflict can now destabilize multiple systems at once. Iran shook oil, alliance trust, shipping, and diplomacy. Europe's leaders spoke more bluntly because the old language no longer hides the strain. Russia benefited from division. Africa was warned to prepare for imported pain. Haiti remained a regional wound with international management wrapped around it. And the Pacific reminded everyone that strategic competition now reaches even the smallest islands. This was not a world compartmentalizing crises. It was a world letting them bleed into one another. Open debates. SKN commentary. What April 2nd exposed is that the world order now behaves less like a system and more like a chain reaction. One war drives prices up, alliances apart, poorer regions deeper into hardship, and opportunistic powers into stronger positions. The people who speak most often of stability are still the first to make instability everyone else's burden. That is the contradiction sitting inside today's headlines. The powerful continue to act as though crisis is something they can manage from above, but the evidence keeps showing a harsher truth. They are producing fires faster than they can contain them, and the bill keeps landing on people with the least power to avoid it. When Africa pays for Gulf war shocks, when Haiti remains trapped between gangs and foreign force, and when Europe has to publicly plead for seriousness from Washington, the message is plain. This is no longer a world being responsibly led. It is a world being dangerously improvised. April 2nd did not show a world under control. It showed a world where one fire now has the power to set whole regions trembling.